Oops.
I don't see it yet.
Yeah, it'll take a sec. Anything?
Yep.
Yep.
Looks like it's loading right
Oh,
now.
all right. So we're up. It says, hello, Park Slope together. It's Sony here. You're on with me and
Christy?
we got to work that little banter situation
I
out a little
know.
bit.
I know.
And we have the great pleasure of bringing Shahana Hanif on tonight. She is one of our council candidates, and we get to spend some time with her. Looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Shahana is the daughter of Bangladeshi immigrants. She lives in Kensington, was born and raised there, right, Shahana?
That's right.
She was diagnosed with lupus, and the reason that I bring this all up is because it seems to have informed a lot of the work that you're doing now and the work that you've done in the recent past. So, for example, that elevator that we are waiting for on the 7th Avenue FG line, that's some of
That's
Shahana's
right.
work. And she did that because she was a staffer working for Brad Lander. She also, working for Brad Lander, inspired a computer course for Bangladeshi seniors that was taught in Bangla and held in Kensington. So welcome, Shahana.
Thank you so much, Sony and Christy and Park Slope together to invite me and for hosting these series. It's so important that we reach out to our neighbors in this upcoming and very important election. And our Facebook groups are such an incredibly valuable tool to spread the message.
We think so. Despite the technological flaws we have sometimes, we think it's helpful. So let's get right into it. Christy, I know that you were curious a little bit about some of the work that Shahana had done.
Yeah, I was reading your Teen Vogue interview, which was fabulous. And I read that you were director of organizing and community engagement for Brad Lander.
That's right.
And I was just wondering, what were some of the ways that you did community outreach? How would you do it differently if you were in that seat? Or how do you get the community involved in what you do and letting us know how we can help you accomplish things?
Absolutely. I love that question. And I will start off by sharing that I never saw myself in government. I come from a tenant organizing background. I was a public housing tenant organizer at an organization called CAV. And much of what I've learned about multilingual organizing, meeting folks where they're at, and building community power comes from my background as a tenant organizer, which I feel our government needs to adopt. We need to have organizer elected, and it's why I'm so excited to continue the good work that Brad has done over the last 3 terms, and to build on the incredible work, because we have so many communities in the 39 district that have been sidelined from resources, sidelined from the political discourse and civic engagement opportunities. So I came in to Brad's office after Trump was elected. And it was such a poignant moment in New York City, and particularly in our district, because immediately our immigrant neighbors were under attack. Queer neighbors, trans neighbors under attack. And so having the largest South Asian Muslim community in all of Brooklyn, right here in the 39th, pushed Brad to extend a hand and bring me into this work. So it was an invitation. I didn't even interview for the job, because prior to coming into Brad's office, I formed a neighborhood association called the Kensington Stewards, and transformed an empty lot into what is now Avenue C Plaza in Kensington, between Kensington and Borough Park in the southern part of our district, we do not have vast, robust open spaces. And so there's a disparity of open spaces in our district. And so it's through that formation of Avenue C Plaza when I got to know Brad, because I was hosting a rally and protest and had invited Brad to share remarks. And so Brad brings me in, and the first iteration of my work was as the Bangladeshi community liaison. And this was the first time that there was intention behind recruiting talent from the district, a Bangladeshi organizer and a woman at that. I'm coming in with also a feminist analysis of how we dismantle patriarchy and sexism in this work. Organizing is tough. So coming in with feminist principles to build community power in what was some of the most tumultuous moments in New York City, particularly after having lived through 9/11. And so community building was one of the prongs of my work. And then the second principle of my work was to bring in targeted city services so that our neighbors at risk of ICE attacks, at risk of deportations, now delayed reunification with their family members because of this presidency, was an opportunity to scope out, well, what services does the city have to offer, city initiatives, and which community partners can we bring into the community to resource these neighbors. And so I built a Kensington office, and it was a storefront in partnership with a medical doctor, a very popular medical doctor in the neighborhood, because I wanted to be seen. I wanted to demystify what it is that your elected official can do. And I also wanted to show to folks that a trusted person, a trusted woman from the neighborhood who was born and raised out here, went to PS 230, went to schools across the neighborhood, and then graduated from CUNY Brooklyn College, is somebody they could trust. Because what we've done for so many communities out here is build mistrust. We don't trust our elected officials to deliver. I wanted to change that. I wanted to make sure our neighbors knew that we've got your back. So what this office did, and I had a big sandwich board that said my name, and when I was here every single Wednesday, it became a legal clinic. It became where, in partnership with CUNY Citizenship Now, we were offering pro bono legal services every second Wednesday of the month. And every week on Wednesdays, I was there because the second largest issue was around tenant protections. And so this office became both a service hub for our immigrant neighbors, predominantly our Bangladeshi neighbors who speak Bangla. And as somebody who speaks, reads, and writes in Bangla, I take a lot of responsibility of making sure that our city, while we're bringing in these services, that I'm doing the job of making sure that we have language justice in the city. We have failed our limited English proficient residents across the city, including in our neighborhood, which further makes the distrust we have in government deeper. And so there have been instances when the city has produced materials to share out to council member offices where I've been vocal about what you've put out in Bangla is absolutely unreadable. And we had that happen when ICE was patrolling South Brooklyn, in particular Kensington, Sunset Park. The Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs had put out materials across spoken languages in New York City. The Bangla literature was unreadable, and unreadable material is dangerous. It's harmful. It for me, allows for deportations. It allows for ICE to come into your home. And so we scrapped what Moya had produced. And through my work organizing here, I cultivated a rapid translation team so that in moments like this, and of course we were calling out the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs and partners who I build with, I was like, you have to do better and rely on community members to review this literature. And so while we're doing the advocacy to make them do better, on the ground, because it was so urgent, folks in the community retranslated this literature, contextualized it for the community here. And then what I did was bring in our faith leaders like Congregation Beth Elohim, Indivisible Nation Brooklyn, Get Organized Brooklyn, other community leaders and partners to help disseminate this information in mass. We shared out over 1,000 Know Your Rights literature to immigrant communities across languages. That is the work that I was able to do in Councilmember Lander's office. And that was just a chunk of my portfolio. The other thing I did is lead participatory budgeting. And it is the only initiative in our city that allows young people as young as 11 to vote in something. It is the only civic engagement initiative that allows our undocumented neighbors to vote on projects pertaining to their neighborhoods. And so what participatory budgeting has done for District 39 is we've been able to democratize how the city's budget gets spent. So this is the direct funding allocated to the council member's office. 1.5 million of that funding out of 5 million that we get allocated for capital resources is decided on by our community members through a process that begins with idea collection, proposal development, and then voting. What I wanted to see is equity in this process, because I recognized that the leadership pipeline did not have enough young people, did not have enough people with disabilities, did not have folks who are limited English proficient, and undocumented folks. And so for an initiative that takes pride in claiming that this is an opportunity for young people, for undocumented folks, well, what are we doing to engage those communities? And so language access was a big part of it, bringing in an outreach partner to help build out an infrastructure to get more of our South Asian community members to submit ideas and become, in PB terminology, budget delegates, these volunteers to help out develop proposals to bring them into the fold. And so with an outreach partner, we hosted a neighborhood assembly. And this was the first time we hosted a in Bangla neighborhood assembly. Over 50 of our neighbors showed up to that. And it hurts me to know that over the 10 cycles, District 39 has participated in PB, and it was Councilmember Lander who brought it into New York City with the support of community partners like the Participatory Budgeting Project, that we had not dedicated enough time to really support bringing in our undocumented community members, our immigrant community members. What I was able to do in the cycles I've led it is bring in community-based organizations like Malika, a Muslim women-led self-defense organization, to come in through the council's discretionary funding process, which is a tough application if you're a small nonprofit with limited capacity. I was really looking out for our smaller nonprofits that were women-led, Muslim-led, and rooted in social justice and organizing, because I believe that the work that we do in our communities must outlive any elected official's term. So what is the infrastructure I'm building up? What are community members building up to sustain and to be resilient beyond a term of an elected official? And so Malika won that cycle. It was a series of self-defense workshops. We partnered with the Center for Anti-Violence Education, their dojo in South Slope. And so that partnership was also critical to recognize the need for safe spaces for youth and Muslim women in particular. And they did a series of self-defense trainings that ranged from conversations about sexual health to combating Islamophobia to physical self-defense training, and most importantly, created a sisterhood that is hard to do for women who are growing up in Kensington, immigrant women who are growing up in Kensington. We do not have a youth center, for example. So these partnerships and identifying these partnerships to bring in programming is how I do the work. And bringing in programming is a big step in empowering our neighbors to eventually be like, okay, we're gonna now come together to build that youth center, because folks have been calling for it annually through PB. We need a women's center. We need a youth center, for example. And then more recently, a couple years ago, I connected with Camp Friendship, and recognizing how we can collaborate in those ways where there are vacant spaces in the district. And so how can we really build across our neighborhoods to program and to build out to include youth who have been excluded from such programming and dreaming of programming. I want folks to be able to cultivate what they want to see here in their neighborhoods. And participatory budgeting has been one of those ways that we've been able to bring in necessary funding. I mean, some of the larger capital projects have included, like at PS 58, I worked to make a greener, safer play yard. At PS 130, I helped to fund new flooring and an indoor plant lab. And then at PS 124, when their music course was slashed, we partnered with Brooklyn Conservatory of Music to provide continued music and arts programming, because it's essential for students. I've been part of the advocacy efforts led by parents to bring in halal food options at PS 179, for example. Because having options brings food justice to our children. And so there are so many layers of constituent servicing that for me is really rooted in meeting our neighbors where they're at, and encouraging experimentation and feeling like they can share what they want to see. So I'd like to see participatory mechanisms of governance expanded. Participatory budgeting is one way. And you might know during COVID, it was slashed citywide, and District 39, right before I left to run my campaign full time, I created an infrastructure so that our leaders, our neighbors felt like they had the strength to continue this process despite not having citywide support. So we completed that cycle. We completed cycle 10. And so I am committed to restoring participatory budgeting citywide, but also the way in which I cultivate our office will demonstrate participatory governance. Co-governance is so important for me. It is the biggest way we bring in voices that have been sidelined by the political discourse. I'm in this work.
Can you give a little bit of an example of what you mean by co-governance? Like how does that look and how does that function?
So I'd love to give the example of the work I've done with Avenue C Plaza. So I named that this work happened with neighbors coming together. We created the Kensington Stewards. And so there was no electoral or political engagement at that point. We had seen an empty lot. We had recognized that we wanted the space to be used for community purposes. And then of course, liaise with the council member's office because of the process of getting this space to become a public plaza required liaising with the council member's office to then liaise with the Department of Transportation and other city agencies to bring in the funding we needed and the capital infrastructure needs to make this space a plaza. And so working with our elected official and these agencies is an example of co-governance, where what we wanted to see directly happen in our neighborhood was not rejected. We had a proactive listener in Councilmember Brad Lander and his team at the time. And the biggest part of the co-governance model is that it goes beyond just working with your elected official. It is also about building leadership within the community, because what is happening now with Avenue C Plaza is that as a result of the work I've done in Councilmember Brad Lander's office is create or incubate a coalition of arts organizations to activate and maintain the programming that happens on the plaza. And that work requires engaging with our neighbors. And so as part of how I think about co-governance in conjunction with a feminist Green New Deal, or how we look after our open spaces, is that people need to be in charge of programming that is happening, and opening up those outlets. Opening up those outlets is essential. So supporting the capacity of community-based organizations like Arts and Democracy, Casa Cultural, Bangladeshi Institute of Performing Arts, for all of them to be in one space, to be able to identify what kind of programming their members like, and then having presence annually has brought in more neighbors into shaping what programming look like. And beyond programming, this open space has also served as a community gathering hub, where after the uptick in attacks on our Muslim neighbors, on our Jewish community members, we have consistently gathered together to address hate, to address how we build community power and community solidarity. And council member or myself, we were engaged in those conversations because those conversations help inform, well, what can we push for on the legislative end or budget end, so that the Commission on Human Rights, for example, has the capacity to take on complaints or to report adequate complaints when our community members are under attack, or how this conversation actually aids in determining what are community safety mechanisms in a neighborhood that has been impacted by over-policing and surveillance. So it is really getting in it's a push for us to reclaim our blocks. It is a push for us to be in conversation with our neighbors in determining, well, what do we want to see here? Why don't we have benches in this open space? Or how can I be a part of this community garden and the decisions that get made about this particular community garden? I want to see more democracy.
So to bring something like co-governance to life in a real meaningful way that could span the district, what needs to happen?
So I think one of the examples I shared is about when ICE was patrolling our neighborhoods. And what I saw across the district is, or what I wanted to organize was, and which was successful, is the cross-class organizing that needs to happen. I recognize the district being unique in that we have deep segregation across the schools in this district, to some neighborhoods being more affluent than others being home to a growing undocumented community. And so bringing us together is imperative as we fight white supremacy, as we talk about what solidarity with Black communities look like, what integrating our schools and our neighborhoods look like. And so the only way we do that is by building these relationships. And the council member has a real responsibility and a key role in making those connections come to life. And that is work I've done by building across our neighborhoods, identifying strong partners and allies, looking out for immigrant communities, or looking out for ways to engage folks who've been outside of politics, to folks who are in the work of education, equity, and integration in our district, who recognize, yeah, we actually need language access to more efficiently consult with our immigrant families and Black and brown parents who've been sidelined. And so one of the core ways is to continue to build those partnerships and deepen those partnerships. This district needs to be pushed and needs to be pushed on equity. And so I think this is an opportunity to really shift the way we've been collaborating with one another. And I'm really inspired by the work happening across this district with mutual aid networks. We are seeing a shift in how we redistribute power and redistribute wealth. I'm so excited by the work you've been doing, Sony, with Camp Friendship. It is transformative. It is exactly what we need in this district, and the connections right now to be made with the work we're doing in the south part of the district. So these connections are necessary and can be fostered and coordinated with the council member.
So this was going to lead right into the next question that I was going to ask, which you're hitting on here, which is since our district is so varied in its needs, what are you seeing at some of the polar ends, like maybe here in Park Slope? What are you seeing as some of the needs that we've got here? Some of the needs you might be seeing in Kensington. Where are we different, and then in which ways are we overlapping?
So I'll start with how we're overlapping, because there is a love for our neighborhoods. We want to live here. We want our neighborhoods to be safe. We want them to be affordable. We want to be able to walk out and have spaces in our neighborhoods that are walkable. We want elevators across stations. So there's a lot of solidarity. There's a lot of solidarity in how we're actually similar in wanting better for our kids, wanting improved senior services. And so a lot more similarities than honestly differences. And the affluent socioeconomic differences aside, I think we need to lean in on our similarities here, what we all want to see across the district. And so, of course, in the southern part of the district, home to some of the largest undocumented community members, and this has only happened really over the course of the last 10, 15 years, this like burst of undocumented folks, and particularly from Bangladesh. I've seen our folks get into unregulated work sectors. And right now it is critical that we pay attention to the insertion of big tech companies that are taking advantage of undocumented workers or workers who aren't citizens yet, and not allowing paid sick leave, having them misclassified as independent contractors. These include our bike food delivery workers. This includes some sectors of domestic workers. This includes undocumented construction workers who are part of the excluded workers, like the bunch that we understand to be excluded workers, and taxi workers who through COVID have been fighting for medallion debt relief, which the city manufactured. And so I actually would like to see the district get to know what is happening across the district and where the challenges are and where we can actually come to the fight together. And that's what I saw during the peak of COVID, where, when young people were having trouble getting a remote device for themselves and their siblings, and needing to fill out applications that were only in English. And as I was supporting them, I was connected to school communities in our district to see if they had an extra laptop, or if there were outside groups, collecting laptops that we could urgently give out in this rapid moment. That's important to me, that we understand holistically what's happening. And as I move forward in this conversation, I want to see more funding go towards our open spaces. I want to really be embedded in our school communities, because there's a disparity in the PTA funding to the distribution of the Fair Student Funding Formula, to the limited language access available to our parent communities. And so I see a real role here to really bring communities together, and have conversations to aid what the district office could look like, what the role I could play more strongly as I get into this role.
So let's start pulling apart some of those issues that you were just talking to. That sounds like a good segue. Before we leave it, though, I've got to bring up again the e-bike thing because it comes up all the time as an
Yeah.
issue, and one that we here are responding to in one way with an eye towards handling this in the way that we might normally by calling the police, involving 311 is going to create a host of problems for people that we don't actually want to cause problems for. And so finding that overlap in a way to figure out, okay, how do we make everyone feel safe here and solve our problems is one thing that I think our community doesn't have an easy answer to because we struggle with it every time it comes up on our Facebook page. So how might your council office facilitate something like that?
So I'll talk about a time right before COVID when a couple of Bangladeshi Muslim boys were picked up by the precinct, and basically they and I had learned about it from my dad, who was like, "What can you do to take them out because they're so young and they made a mistake?" And then I reach out to the precinct. I'm like, I heard that these really young boys have been picked up. What did they do? What kind of trouble did they get into? And I learned that they were picked up because they threw eggs at some of our Jewish community members, and synagogues. And so for me, while engaging in conversation with the precinct to understand the sort of volatile nature of this case, because Muslim boys being criminalized means their life is over in our city. And we've seen that over and over within like the start of their lives as they enter schools. And so we need restorative approaches to responding to something that was a mistake, or showed to me the significance of why we need youth centers across the district, why we need youth programming, why we need to invest in after school programming that the kids want in our schools. So while we've divested from these programs, we have used carceral responses to pick up Muslim boys and Black boys, of course. And so for me, while engaging with the precinct and the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, because that's our current reality right now. The reality is we've got precinct, we've got a DA's office, and to push them to use restorative approaches in how they respond to what happens with the Muslim boys right now. Immediately on the ground, I brought together a coalition of neighbors and organizations to demand a community defense program that calls out the harmful attack and proactively supports our Jewish neighbors and calls for restorative justice for the Muslim boys who were arrested. I coordinated with community-based organizations. So community-based organizations that are building power on the ground need to be collaborated with, and has been a big strategy of mine in how we respond, how we co-govern. So Daisy's Rising Up and Moving Drum, they represent a membership of South Asians across the city. They have a big base in our district. I brought Jews for Racial Economic Justice, that's JFREJ, the New York City Commission on Human Rights, Center for Anti-Violence Education, which over the course of how we were resolving this, we're offering upstander trainings to our neighbors and larger conversations. And we use the rapid translation team strategy to build out literature in Yiddish and in Bangla, reviewed by our community leaders. And we went door to door in Kensington and Windsor and Borough Park to share out information about how to respond to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other hate violence. These conversations need to happen. We can't just theorize about what community safety looks like. And of course, this thing that we did was experimental. I mean, I had sat down with organizers at JFREJ, and I was like, what should we do? So much of the work that I want to do is be innovative, be creative, use community resources, and see where the weaknesses are, and what the council could do to expand, for example, the funding that goes to the Commission on Human Rights. They are a severely underfunded city agency, or community-based organizations like Drum and JFREG that do the day-to-day work of the political education around how systems have failed New York, everyday New Yorkers, working class kids across the city. So when we did this walk across our neighborhoods, almost every single neighbor was receptive to the message of building a community that supports one another across boundaries. No one said, please bring a police car in front of my business, or help me install a camera on my window. Like, there was nothing like that. And the solidarity in recognizing that we've got to strengthen our neighborhood ties was what was reverberating from these conversations. And so some of the conversations were challenging because it spoke to the needs of what is not here within our neighborhoods across the district. And so, like, youth centers, services for seniors, adequate playground and park space so that youth could bike around and play basketball, renovations that haven't been done adequately and sufficiently. And so that's one example of just like the intricacy and local organizing I want to continue cultivating as council member. And there's countless other groups that have been building on this. There are models for us to study on what community safety looks like on the ground. And I see District 39, because of the uniqueness of the neighborhoods here and the communities that live here and call this community home, in shaping how we do this work, how we actually respond to issues of community that are non-carceral approaches that push us to talk to neighbors, and liaising with the precinct and the district attorney to also push them to make sure that their approach is decarceral.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, as a result of this work, of course, like I've also been part of the movement work. All of us were out in the summer protesting and memorializing George Floyd's life. And this was the single time that, as a council staffer, I received an influx of emails about defunding the NYPD. And that was entirely people-powered led. Of course, we didn't defund the budget, but I was part of the movement activation, leaning on what our neighbors were pushing for. It is important we are responsive.
So just building off of that, we'll just piggyback into what specifically you would look for a defunding of the police. Are you of the $3 billion camp?
I am.
Okay. So based on what you've said, it sounds like you would be investing a lot more you would be pushing for a decrease in school resource officers and an increase in social workers, mental health training, and all sorts of things at the school and community levels.
Absolutely. And it works. I mean, it is slow work. It takes coordinating with our neighbors, having conversations that are conflicting at times. I remember a couple years ago when there was an incident in Port Authority, 42nd Street, and the young man who was charged with this incident was from Kensington. And immediately, so many of our mosque leaders were like, we need police officers, and we need surveillance cameras. And I had to insert myself, bring in trusted organizers who speak the language, because we've got to be trained in having these conversations in our languages. And that is hard work, debating your own neighbor, debating your community and trying to push them. And sometimes we don't win. But we must continue to push our community. And so in this one incident, it took about a week for us to come to a consensus that we were not going to push for more patrols in front of our mosques. cameras installed in our mosques. And that was because we needed to visit the history of what 9/11 did to us, and how the NYPD has continued to use surveillance apparatuses and pay informants who look like us, talk like us, to come into our mosques and other public institutions to entrap community members. And so that history must continue to be told on like how the Muslim community, the Sikh community, so many of our allied communities have been impacted by this police system. And so these tough conversations led us to the sort of Friday memorial where we were like, we want to host an interfaith conversation where we want to see our other faith leaders and faith communities show up for us in deeper ways. So that interfaith organizing has also been a part of my trajectory. I mean, I grew up Muslim, still living in a predominantly Muslim community. And so interfaith organizing and really using a tool of bringing community together shared by faith has been really essential in talking about community safety in this work.
Christy, I think you had something.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. So do you have a vision of how you would ideally begin to restructure not a police department, but the responses? You know, would you how you would like, would you have mental health workers and de-escalation specialists working for the department or outside of the department, working for the city or privately owned companies? So how do you envision that?
So, I mean, the first thing I'll say is, you know, we didn't defund anything from the police budget. And so, you know, the experience I described of the kind of organizing I do is actually to empower people to like, for their default like response to not be, let me call 911. And so these conversations door to door are important because we need community mediation mechanisms. We need to know which are the resources that are here. And if there aren't, the council member has a clear role in bringing in those services through discretionary funding, through just partnerships and networking. And so the first big piece for me is like, how do we become less reliant on this like addiction we have to calling the police for things that can be handled by community? So that's one piece. And I say this, and I'm adamant about this because I've seen as a domestic violence caseworker, both in my time at Councilmember Lander's office and at Sakhi for South Asian Women, when survivors have called 911, the response overall has been apathy, has not been to provide services that would make survivors feel safe. And so that is troubling for me. And so now getting to the question about like, what does defunding and demilitarizing look like? I mean, the first step is, or what could happen immediately is us stopping the building up of the NYPD's force. And that means freezing new hires. It means canceling new cadet classes. And it means, for me in particular, as somebody who grew up post 9/11 in the 5th grade at PS 230 and seeing the impacts of NYPD surveillance, is cutting budgets for surveillance infrastructure that consistently has shown to target Black and Brown New Yorkers. And so those are the 3 mechanisms that I see could be utilized. And we're going to need to organize the other city council members because, again, we didn't see, we were far from defunding. We saw some funny political math. And then organizing the mayor and the speaker. So there's work to be done in the city council to really be aligned. And so, and it's why, for me, I am accountable to our movement spaces. I'm accountable to the folks who have experienced the harm firsthand and our allies who recognize the conditions of working class people, our immigrant neighbors, Black and Brown folks, low income folks. And so this means fighting together to remove police from schools. It means removing police response from mental health services, from homeless outreach, from domestic violence. And I've gotten to do some of this work again by like pushing people to shift what they think about safety means by not calling the police as their first response. We've also, I mean, another piece of this is also removing police from traffic. We have seen so many of our Black siblings murdered in traffic stops, right? And so there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had about just the history of incarceration in our city. And I think like before we even jump into cutting budgets and we really need to get everybody on the same page about how incarceration has been a business. It has been manufactured in the city to tear apart families, to destroy the lives of Black and Brown folks in this city. And so like remedying problems at hand is my focus. But I understand the nuance of, and the slowness and the kind of innovation we need, because we haven't seen this. We have lived in a city that has relied on carceral mechanisms to responding to like some of the simplest things that shouldn't be designated as a crime. So I'd love to see, of course, mental health services, but I also recognize like one of the things, again, around language access is so many folks are unable to access mental health services. So for me, it goes beyond just like funding services, because are those services adequately meeting the needs of folks who need them? Are they reaching the ground? We don't have a citywide initiative, and Thrive hasn't been successful. Thrive NYC, which was the city's initiative to offer New Yorkers free peer-to-peer mental health services. I love the model. We should have peer-to-peer approaches on how we take care of one another, but they've had a mismanagement of funding. So there needs to be more transparency and accountability on like how city agencies are doing their work, but for that information to reach all New Yorkers, because that was like the biggest conversation I was having with friends who are therapists and social workers, that they were at capacity, they were just overbooked. And then friends who were searching for mental health providers being unable to navigate this system that is chaotic and so stigmatized also. So there's a lot of work to do that for me isn't just about funding, like let's just pull funding into another agency without thinking about, well, how are we addressing the issues that are coming up? Because for the mental health issues, at least, we need to pass the New York Health Act. We need to have a health care plan for this city that includes mental health services, that make it easy and inclusive for people to receive those services. And that is the question for me. Like, how do I, as a council member with communities, make our city agencies work better, do what they've been tasked to do? How do we hold them accountable when they're not showing up for communities? And how do we advocate for more?
I'd love to see what you come up with for that one. Let's hit Gowanus. We have to, of course, because it is the biggest thing that is going to affect our community, and on like every level. It's
right.
It's all your things all in one package.
Absolutely.
So let's start with just the affordable housing element and kind of your philosophy on the build itself. So leaving aside for the moment the environmental issues, just looking at the build plan, are you of the philosophy that we should slow the build? I mean, again, regardless of the environmental stuff. In other words, is this a necessary evil that we have to get ourselves affordable housing? Or are you thinking that the way to go is to reinvigorate our Nycha housing that already exists? How would you approach this proposal if it were coming to you for the first time?
So What our neighbors have demonstrated is exactly how I would approach this, and that is really bringing in the voices of our communities, not just limited to tenants, but arts organizations, arts workers, to environmental activists. We cannot separate the climate conversation from Gowanus and other degraded lands in the city. So the remediation component is absolutely critical when we talk about building affordable housing in the city. I am in favor of building affordable housing. We have a massive affordability crisis in the city, and a lack of housing. And when I talk about the creation of housing, I acknowledge that this is a gender justice issue for me, and it should be for all of us, because domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness. We have relied on warehousing survivors and other communities who have not been able to afford permanently affordable housing into shelters. Shelters that are not supportive spaces all the time, that require you to leave to another shelter, so constant displacement. And so if we don't acknowledge this issue from a gender justice perspective, we will continue to live with the fact that this is a city that does not believe in housing women in particular. So I want to see affordable housing built, but recognizing that the current area median income breakdown is not meeting the salaries or the income levels of our most working class communities, or folks who have a voucher, the city FEPS voucher as an example, that needs to be altered to meet the market rate cost. And that's a proposal on the floor right now by Council Member Steve Levins that can be pushed right now. That doesn't need to wait for us in the next administration. So there are mechanisms that that we should be utilizing to keep folks who are in homes housed, and for us to expand the city VEPS voucher program so that more folks are able to afford the rent of the housing stock in New York City. As a former tenant organizer, including Nycha residents is a big priority. I come from the time of when the conversations about privatization were happening about Wyckoff Gardens. I was organizing at Queensbridge houses in Long Island City, but partnering with organizations like Fifth Avenue Committee and Fury, local to our district, and trying to prevent privatization. Nycha has continued to bear the brunt of tenant harassment and displacement mechanisms. So we have got to create, this is what I'm committed to doing, create stronger anti-harassment and anti-displacement policies to keep our neighbors housed and to prevent unjust evictions, which is what we're seeing right now at 70 Prospect Park West, where
Right.
a private developer, a predatory developer, bought the building and everyone received a vacate order. And if it wasn't for their WhatsApp group, the residents would just one by one leave without organizing. And so creating an office that is responsive to the needs of our tenants, whether that is to give organizing tools to tenants to be able to do the work right now that 70 Prospect Park West tenants are doing, to expanding legal counsel for tenants is important. Now with Gowanus, I don't support the plan as is because it has excluded Nycha residents from the entirety of the plan. And I've been moving at the pulse and leadership of the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice, which has laid out the demands and is a incredible representation of community members, longstanding folks from the district, from Gowanus, including our arts workers who have faced, who have been sidelined through the pandemic. And so really making sure that our neighborhood voices are at the front. And for Nycha, which has consistently been at risk of privatization and Nycha land being sold off without getting the full funding they need to repair units and to repair the decrepit buildings is crucial. So I want to see and push for guaranteed funding for Nycha. a model that centers Nycha tenants, both in this coalition space, but also within our community board space, to appoint community board members who are Nycha residents in community board 6. And then this plan hasn't yet, the city hasn't yet delivered an environmental impact assessment, has not delivered on a racial impact assessment. And the trend we've seen with rezoning plans here in our city is the displacement of Black and brown low-income tenants after rezonings get passed. We've seen a lack of accountability from developers who promise an influx of jobs, community jobs, who promise deeply affordable housing. And so we have to be at the front of disrupting the city-led, real estate developer-led model that we have in place in our planning process. I will be pushing for a justice-oriented planning model that will, and there is a push for requiring a racial impact assessment. And so we must receive all of these information before moving forward on a rezoning plan. So I want to continue listening to the work of this group while also recognizing that real estate developers have more money than our community-based coalition spaces. So the city must have a mechanism to support neighbors building up power to reject plans that don't meet the needs of what they envision for our city.
So it seems like it's entirely possible that this decision will be made for our next council person if the ULURP process continues on.
Right.
So it sounds like the work that our council person would have to do really is monitor this whole mess and make sure whatever has the potential of falling through the cracks doesn't. So,
That's right.
So when you look at the proposal that's on the table with the non-negotiables from the coalition, where do you see yourself putting your energies to make sure that the what do you see as the most vulnerable parts of that deal?
So I am deeply scared that we will not receive any money for Nycha. That there will be a compromise and we will not receive any funding to repair the developments that have been on the slate. And so I don't want Nycha residents to be failed by our city once again. And so we will need to organize. We will need to fight these developers and the city planning to guarantee that this money arrives and that the capital improvements, that we have transparency around when construction, repair construction will begin and how long it'll take, and a tracker that is shown to the city at large. We need a capital projects tracker that anybody can look at to see which projects in our district across the city, what the status is, but particularly for Nycha residents to see what is happening with repairs in their buildings. So we need transparency and a watchdogging process to make sure that construction is in fact getting done without disrupting the sewage overflows and other mechanisms that are at risk in terms of the environmental piece of this conversation. And why I feel so deeply about this proposal is because I live with lupus, and lupus is an environmental disease caused by poor public infrastructure. And so we must recognize in this moment in particular, when COVID unearthed and the possibilities of rare diseases unearthing because of climate change, we have got to talk about housing justice with climate justice. And so as we talk about creating affordable housing, remediation of public land of our neighborhoods is critical. And now in the context of building new housing, I want folks to know that when they move to a place, that this is their home. So that we're not forcing New Yorkers to like move to a place and then a couple years later when they are aging and disabled, they need to move somewhere else. So I support visitability requirements that would ensure that any new development that gets built is accessible and adaptable, and homes where folks can age, where folks can where our bathrooms have door grabs, where there's wider doors to enter the building, no steps. And even for disabled folks to visit their friends. We really have to transform the way in which we're creating housing that is accessible to all New Yorkers. And so that is most important to me too, as we think about, well, what does creating housing mean here when we keep forcing people to move out? Because our homes don't have elevators, our homes aren't accessible for folks who use elevators or wheelchairs rather. And so the visitability component is important, and ensuring that when construction is happening, that we don't close off subway entrances that are the accessible entrances. So there's much to think about in the creation of affordable housing that really centers, okay, are there grab bars in the bathrooms? Are we making sure that this is a home that is a home for life, not for a temporary period of your life?
I think we've got a question that came in.
Yes, we do. Someone on Facebook is asking, Sarah asks, do you support letting private companies manage Nycha, or should we fund and improve the current system?
I do not support privatization of Nycha land. We have seen a severe disinvestment over the years, and now there's a moratorium on building any new housing. That money needs to come in, the repair money, the dire the dire unmet repairs that have gone for so long. That money needs to come in from the federal government. And that has not come in. And so while we've used mechanisms within the city council through participatory budgeting, for example, that money is not enough to repair buildings across our city. And what I don't want to see is privatization lead to the getting rid of public housing stock, that we get rid of housing and private developers get to dictate what happens. So right now, I don't support any privatization schemes. I want to see more power building happening among our Nycha residents to inform our elected officials, because Nycha as an agency is not just a city agency. It is a city, state, federal agency. It almost speaks to nobody. There is no transparency in the agency. And it's something that was such a struggle when I was organizing public housing residents across the city. And one of our top demands was language access, so that the tenant associations could do the work to inform what was happening around Nycha land, that decisions were constantly getting made without them in the room. And so I want to see a deeper commitment to Nycha from across city, state, federal levels. And so I'm committed to partnering with our state and federal partners to make sure that Nycha is always prioritized. The unique part about this conversation is that District 39 has no Nycha buildings. So we do not have any developments. And so that is another piece of this affordable housing conversation where actually we have none. Or like we don't have any of the most affordable housing in the city. We share Gowanus with our council member next door, council member Steve Levins. And so that to me means we have got to work together across district boundaries, because the decisions we end up making in the 39th for Gowanus impacts Nycha residents first and worst. So if they're not at the table, we are failing residents once again. And so I want to see better collaboration and partnership between council members that share neighborhoods that are undergoing rezoning proposals, where there's we haven't built a neighborhood-led coalition space to have these conversations, to lead these conversations. And I see the necessity of the council members helping to coordinate these spaces to make sure we are supporting community-based partners, nonprofit developers, to transform the conversation about housing. There is a real opportunity here to fund and support community land trust initiatives, like the work that the New Economy Project is doing. And so there are other mechanisms of how we build social housing, how we build community ownership of our land and get to look after this land. And I'll add to that the component of, is it accessible housing? Is it adaptable housing? And do the features let our New Yorkers know that this is your home. This is where you're going to live, and you'll be safe and you'll be protected.
Cool. We will see how that shift goes. It will be interesting because in the land use, in our work of land use in the city, we have not really made great strides. So making these large changes will be interesting to see. We are a little over an hour, so I don't want to keep you for too long. I'm sure you have many things to do, but I will ask you one final question before you go. And that is, if you could only accomplish just one thing in a single 2-year term, that is what we would be electing you for, what would that single thing be?
So I am proposing a citywide survivor security fund as a result of the work I've done with survivors of domestic violence. And so one of my biggest priorities is to transform how we govern. And I've been calling for a feminist government because of what we've seen sitting council members do and have been accused of serious sexual allegations and have not been expelled at the first time these serious allegations come up. We need to really shift money to support domestic violence organizations, anti-domestic violence organizations, of course, but the city has a responsibility to create a survivor security fund that would take on the financial responsibility of providing rent, like a 1-month rent, providing childcare fees. Of course, we have to push for expanding free infant and childcare. And for other basic amenities. What I've seen over and over while working with survivors in our district, and not limited to immigrant women or South Asian women, is that I've had to crowdfund when they were transitioning out of shelter spaces. And the financial barriers are one of the top reasons why survivors return to abusive homes. I don't want to see that. And the city can change that. We could transform how we show up for survivors, how we care for survivors, and not just women survivors. And so this is a gender equity piece for me. And so as we talk about, where defund budget goes, when we tax the rich, where that money goes, I want to see the city have a budget that is responding to the needs of survivors who are transitioning out of shelters.
That sounds amazing. Shahana, thank you so much for your time with us tonight. That was a really robust conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It was a lot to take in, but we really appreciate your time spelling out your ideals for us. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you both. And Sylvia, thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to seeing you all on the trail. We're 34 days out.
Wow. It's gonna
Yeah,
Thank you all.
A lot to cover.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Take care.
Good conversation.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Everyone, thank you.
All right, Park Slope, that's it. We did it. Thank you so much. Tonight we were just with Shahana Hanif. Tomorrow we've got Doug Schneider up. So we'll talk to you again soon. See you tomorrow night, 5 o'clock. Sylvia, thank you as always for holding
Not a
down
problem.
the Facebook. Everyone, see you tomorrow. Thanks so much.